The recording will be available next week, and you'll see a link in the chat to that recording if you want to take a look at that. Also, as you can see, we have the benefit of a sign language interpreter. There will be two of them who will alternate, and you'll be able to see them in the gallery view. So if you turn on your gallery view, you'll see our sign language interpreters. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Elihu Rose, who tonight is going to be speaking on World War II and the movies. And Elihu Rose is an example of the kind of work that we do in the history department, both in terms of our teaching and our research. And many of the things that we work on really give background to our contemporary world and make our understanding of that world a lot richer. And just to say a few words about Elihu Rose, he graduated from Yale University and after that served in the United States Air Force. He is a partner in Rose Associates, a real estate investment and management firm in New York City. Elihu Rose received his PhD from NYU in international relations in 1978. And shortly after that, he began his career as a military historian. He's taught here at NYU and at Columbia, at Yale and the University of Maryland, and he's lectured widely, including at the two main service academies. He's lectured at West Point and also at Annapolis and many other places. And one of the crowning achievements in his career as a teacher in the department here at NYU, in 2002, Elihu Rose won the Outstanding Teaching Award. And he's published since then numerous articles about military history in a variety of history journals. And so I'm now thrilled to turn things over to Elihu Rose, who will be speaking on World War II and the movies. Elihu.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Ed. Ladies and gentlemen, well, as Ed told you, that we're going to talk about World War II and the movies. So let's start with a bang. Maura, can you take it away? Well, I guess most of you will certainly recognize that as the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. Um, I think it's the most, well, certainly it's the most perfect opening scene of any World War II movie. I could propose it for the greatest opening scene of any movie almost that I know. Question, how accurate was it? Well, I remember when the movie opened and lots of veterans would show up for the opening for the film, and they'd come out of the place with post-traumatic stress. I mean, all kinds of veterans refused to see it because it was so realistic. So we'll concede the accuracy of that scene. But I still think it could be put in some kind of context. Look, what we call D-Day, that's June 6th, 1944, 156,000 Brits, Canadians, and Americans landed on 5 widely separated beaches in Normandy. 2 of those beaches were Brits, 1 Canadian, and 2 American. Now let's get back to that number, 156,000. Do you know that's the size of Bridgeport, Connecticut? You know, that's the size of Syracuse. So can you picture every man, woman, and child in Bridgeport, Connecticut being plunked down on a beach in Normandy with people shooting at you? Well, okay, that's the big picture. Now, let's get a little bit closer to Tom Hanks. Certainly he wasn't alone. On Omaha Beach, which this film was, he was one of 33,000 guys that landed there. Now, the place that this picture discusses was in military lingo called a dog green beach. Let's say it was 1,000 yards wide. And this picture accurately, in my view, depicted the death of exactly 496 guys that died right there. That's what we saw in the movie. Now, that was the worst place, on the worst place of all 5 beaches. Look, there was another American beach. It was called Utah Beach. Well, 23,000 guys landed on Utah Beach, and they lost exactly 70. If Spielberg chose to make his film there on that beach, let me tell you, it would be a pretty dull piece of work. So without disparaging the accuracy of that scene, I wanted to just point out that although there was a 7% death rate on Omaha Beach, that's very high. Overall, for the invasion of Normandy, the death rate was probably less than 3%. So what's my takeaway here? The takeaway is, when dealing with the movies, don't confuse history with entertainment. Remember, movies are entertainment, they're not history. Okay. Well, let's start our conversation by considering the 375 or so films that were actually made during World War II, war films made by World War II. Remember, Hollywood had been making all kinds of genres, all kinds of movies, all kinds of genres, you know, screwball comedies and musicals and gangster movies and Westerns. And so at first it was kind of an easy switch. So Hollywood thought all you had to do to make a war movie, put people in uniform, and there it was. You have a war romance, you could have a war comedy, you could have a war musical, but pretty soon it became obvious that The Wizard of Oz with guns was not quite going to do it. And so was born the combat film. Now remember, Hollywood was already dealing with lots of conventions for each of the genres. For example, you go to see a Western, what do you expect to see? Well, there would be the good guy, there'd be the bad guy, there'd be the sheriff, there'd be the shootout, there'd be the posse, there'd be the prostitute with a heart of gold, there would be the fist fight in the saloon. That's what you saw. So in that same vein, the combat film developed its own conventions. And what were these conventions? Okay, well, let's see. It started off with always a small group of men, small group. How many? Well, let's see, the minimum would have been 5. That was a tank crew. Could grow up to, let's say, 7 or 8. And this small group was concerned with a specific military mission. Oh, what could that be? Defending the vital crossroads, defending a bridge, taking some special farmhouse, something like that. And that would have been was the mission and the people. Now, I was about to say the mission, and now we get to the people. So who were the people? Well, at the beginning of the movie, you could see a very, very short appearance of a Midwestern WASP lieutenant, but he didn't stay around for a long time because the emotional center of gravity was the tough sergeant. That would have been John Wayne. Well, who else? There was always a character called the Kid. The Kid was a naive, sensitive, 18-year-old. Think of him as like a male ingenue. Now, the Kid never got killed. His role was to mature and to learn the hard way. But who else was there? Well, let's see, comic relief. The wisecracking Jewish kid. And you could also have, let's say, a guy named Tex. You would have a very taciturn Kentucky mountaineer. And most important, the ethnics, the sine qua non, the ethnics. Who were they? Well, you had to have a guy named Kowalski, you'd have a Ramirez, a kid named Angelo. Now, in this great all-American group, you might be wondering, what about some African Americans? Answer, the military was segregated. The Marine Corps didn't have any blacks at all. So, except with some exceptions, very few, you are not going to find any blacks in World War II movies. Now, there were typical scenes, not in every movie, but typical enough so that you recognize them. For example, if a guy ever showed a picture of his wife and children, that guy got killed. Now, when we're talking about death, these guys got killed in all kinds of different ways. If they could do one at a time, if it was a last stand kind of movie, gee, they could all get killed. And speaking of death, none of the death scenes were anything like you saw in Saving Private Ryan. None of that business about people burning up and getting their faces blown off, anything like that. Nobody in the typical World War movie, the death scene was really very benign. The guy usually died in somebody's arms. By the way, the wound was barely recognizable, a little bit of blood someplace. It didn't look all that bad. As I say, the guy would die in the arms of his buddy, and usually with enough time to make some kind of dying statement about American values. Now, obviously, these conventions vary. They didn't need an infantry squad. an airplane crew would do. A Navy picture, it could be the torpedo room of a submarine. The big thing was that it had to be a small group so that you could recognize the people. So those 8 people, those 7 guys would really be people you would know. Now, the war started, and it really took a long time to tool up to the combat film. Why? There was no combat going on, or very little of it. And that's what you needed to develop a combat scene. Remember, the Marines invaded Guadalcanal in August of 42, and the invasion of North Africa was not until November of 1942. So there was little for them to go on in terms of combat film. However, a little bit of history. If you remember, the war started in December, early December, December 7th, 1941. And for 6 months, exactly 6 months to early April, America was involved with a catastrophic defeat in the Philippines at a place called Bataan. And I use that word again, it was a catastrophe. 25,000 American troops surrendered on Bataan. It was the greatest capitulation in American military history. Well, how was this presented to the American public? Maura, how about letting us show that clip about Bataan? You love it? All you red-blooded Americans, boy, that was, that was a great rallying cry. And I told you, it represented, it's a pictorial representative of a military catastrophe. But look, that clip was about less than 3 minutes. But in that clip alone, you saw the entire formula. You saw the small group. This was a larger group than typical. Say it was 12. Typical group would be 7. But there you saw the military mission. You saw the tough sergeant. You saw the ethnics. You saw the last stand. You saw the whole formula. By the way, what you didn't see, what was in there, even the kid. I mean, there was one of the characters that you didn't see. So there's an example of the whole formula, which became the formula for virtually all World War II films. I say that because about 7 years ago, there was a very good movie, a successful movie, I loved it. It was called Fury. Instead of John Wayne, Brad Pitt. And everything else was the same. The kid, the picture of the wife and children, the last stand, everything, the ethnics. And I looked at that movie and I said to myself, this is a perfect 1944 movie, except that it was 60 years later. I guess the moral of that one is plus ça change. Okay, in those years, 80 million Americans, including me, went to the movies every week. 80 million. That's 2/3 of the entire population. So the government obviously saw films as a great mechanism for mobilizing public opinion and relating to the American public. At that time, by the way, America was the only major country that didn't have an official information bureau or something like that. And here we get into two words that are still anathema to America, to Americans, propaganda and censorship. And this puts us on a slippery slope. Who knows when entertainment becomes propaganda or when a suggestion from the government becomes censorship. Now, the government had two organizations to deal with this. In Washington, the overall conduct of the war, the relationship to the war to the American people was in the hands of the Office of War Information, called the OWI. And in Hollywood, there was an offshoot called the Bureau of Motion Pictures, which dealt with Hollywood directly. But that relationship with Hollywood was never a happy one. The big studio moguls, older ones among you might even remember the names: Louis Mayer, Jack Warner, Samuel Goldwyn. Those guys, they were all patriotic guys. They all wanted to support the war effort. But they knew what worked at the box office. They felt they knew better than the government. Remember, they saw not only films as an art form, they saw it as a business. So yes, they tried to walk the narrow path between propaganda and entertainment and making a buck. I would say it worked because those were the most money-making years of Hollywood. So another point is, every now and then some academic film historians will try to make a big thing out of government censorship. You know, I don't know, maybe it's a good dissertation topic, but the truth is there was not a lot of government censorship. There didn't have to be. This was not like Vietnam. There was not a lot of public opposition. There was a lot of, or there was universal support for the war. So as I say, the censorship never was all that heavy-handed. But there were other forms of censorship. All film producers looked for the imprimatur of the Catholic Legion of Decency. I don't have to go too deep into what would be their attitudes. Of much more importance was the Motion Picture Production Code. Now, that was an industry self-censorship. They were not interested in policy. They didn't care what was in the movie. They were interested in morality, and they were excessively prudish. And that prudery definitely affected the realism, the speech, the action, certainly the sex in movie. Well, let's take language. According to the production code, you know, you couldn't even use words like hell or damned. Now, any of you who've been within 50 yards of a military base will know that excessive profanity is the lingua franca. It's the normal speech pattern. It's the way they communicate. So you take that out of a film, you take profanity out of a film, when I told you they couldn't even use the word damn, then you say you definitely lost something. You lost something in reality. Now, believe it or not, this production code lasted until, I don't know, late 60s. But as you know, between then and now, as Cole Porter would say, anything goes, and you can use any kind of language limited only by your imagination. Now, the military itself enacted a form of censorship, and they did it in this way. If they didn't like a script, or if they felt that in any way the film was against the interest of the military, they simply refused to provide technical support. Obviously, you can't make a war movie without military support, unless you felt like you were going to build your own battleship. By the way, speaking of censorship, here's something I turned up. I can call it social censorship. And it turned up in my looking at the that clip of Bataan. What was not clear in the Bataan clip that I showed you, one of those soldiers was actually Black. Now that's an anomaly because there were no Black soldiers. There was certainly, the army at that time was segregated even more than later, and there were no Blacks in the Philippine garrison. However, the inclusion of that one Black soldier in that group was enough so that movie distributors in the American South refused to show the film. Well, as I said, the Office of War Information may have exerted a light touch on outright censorship, but look, from time to time, they did have their legitimate concerns. There were issues of political sensitivity, and one of them refers to everybody's favorite movie, Casablanca. Now, I'm assuming that everybody out there has seen Casablanca. And if you haven't, be ashamed of yourself. And tonight, instead of seeing Netflix, see Casablanca. Anyway, Casablanca was very early in the war, 1942. There hadn't been any real combat films until that time. Now, here's the problem. Casablanca, took place in Morocco. So what was the problem? Now, a little bit of history. Morocco at that time was under the control of the Vichy French government. That Vichy French government under Philippe Pétain was the governing entity of France under German occupation. America had a diplomatic relationship with that government, but we were much closer allied with their arch enemy, General de Gaulle. So that presented a little bit of a problem. The problem solved itself. How? Well, 2 weeks before the movie was to be introduced, America invaded Morocco, and that solved that problem. However, look, since I mentioned Casablanca, and the truth is I can't resist showing you a clip of one of its most famous scenes. So here, Maura is going to show us a clip in which we see a bunch of rowdy German officers singing a patriotic song, and they're in Humphrey Bogart's cafe. Maura, let's show them Casablanca.
Laszlo's presence in a cafe can inspire this unfortunate demonstration, but Morville's presence in Casablanca bring on. I advise that this place be shut up at once.
But everybody's having such a good time.
Yes, much too good a time. The place is to be closed.
But I've no excuse to close it.
Find one.
Everybody is to leave here immediately. This cafe is closed until further notice. Clear the room at once.
How can they close me up? On what ground?
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
Mademoiselle, after this disturbance, it is not safe for Laszlo to stay in Casablanca.
This morning.
Well, that's that classic scene. Now, some of you will know where that phrase, I'm shocked comes from. If you would see a little bit more of the film, you'd hear him say, round up the usual suspects. So anyway, that's, I thought you'd like to see that movie. And I told you, if you haven't seen it, see it tonight. Look, we mustn't overplay the influence of war films made during the war itself. Those films weren't very good. And the truth is there were a lot of backlot production stuff. For example, in 1944 was the height of the war. Of the 27 most popular movies that year, only 7 related to the war at all. And of the 7, 2 were service comedies. Okay, that brings us to documentaries. Now, look, today documentaries are a dime a dozen. You go on YouTube and you'll find zillion documentaries, including all kinds of documentaries about World War II. But during the war, documentaries were the new game in town, and they weren't all like the documentaries we see today. They used real people, not actors. They of course, there were voiceovers, but the idea was people, not actors. Not so, the soldiers were soldiers. The airmen were airmen, and that gave it a sense of humanity and a realism that was really missing in some of the typical war movies. So, about the documentaries, all the big directors, all of them, virtually every one of them, was working for the government. They were making war films of one kind or another, training films, documentaries, as you'll hear. And there are 3 that I would call to your attention because they were really, they were the most important during the war. And if for the nature of our discussion, you should know about them. The first of them was called The Memphis Belle. Now, Memphis Belle, the title, the word Memphis Belle refers to a Southern belle, spelled B-E-L-L-E. And it was about, the name Memphis Belle referred to the nickname that the aircrew gave to its bomber. And these were documentaries in the sense that real people, not the handsome pilot, not the ethnic crew, just real guys. Now, the essence of this movie was, it was the height of the war, 1944, when the air war over Germany was so dangerous that the chances of surviving 25 bomber missions were so slight that if you did survive 25 missions, you got to go home. So here, one of America's greatest directors, William Wyler, put himself on a bomber that was the first bomber to attempt the 25th flight. So you can imagine the great dramatic tension of that film. And by the way, not only can you see it, but it holds up very well. I'm surprised how well it does. As a matter of fact, all the pictures, the early ones, do hold up very well after all, even after 75 years. Now we come to John Ford. Now, if there's any legendary American director, it's John Ford, and he made 2 unforgettable documentaries, which I can talk to you about now. One is called The Battle of San Pietro. It's only 35 minutes. I used to show it to my class. It was about an actual battle that took place in Italy, the Battle of San Pietro. And it was as close to a battlefield picture as you could get without actually getting killed. No actors, soldiers in as I say, in as close a combat position, a combat situation as you can imagine. The end scene showed American dead going into body bags, which made it quite controversial. The American film public was quite comfortable in seeing John Wayne killed, but they were not happy to see Americans going into body bags. Another very moving John Ford picture is called Let There Be Light, and I doubt you know anything about it. It concerned what we would now call post-traumatic stress. Now, 20% of all wartime casualties, military casualties, was psychiatric, but not like now, where post-traumatic stress is a word with which we are all familiar. At that time, it carried a stigma. People were embarrassed about it. There was a military expression, Section 8. That was the military designation for a psychiatric casualty. And as I said, it carried a stigma. So what did John Ford, excuse me, what did John Ford do? He actually went into a psychiatric hospital, and he made his film with real psychiatrists and treating real psychiatric cases. Well, I told you, it was made at the behest of the Army. But when the film was finished and he showed it at the Pentagon, they hit the ceiling. It was immediately banned, put under lock and key. It's been under lock and key for 40 years. What was their complaint? Well, people saw post-traumatic stress. It would interfere with re-enlistments. It would lower the morale of the soldiers. But he did a great public service in even making the film. It's interesting to see to this day, and like virtually everything I'm talking about tonight, every movie, every documentary can be seen on YouTube. So if there's anything that really catches, anything that I've said that catches your attention, try it on YouTube. Well, the war ended in 1945, excuse me, but the World War II movie was just getting started. You began to have color. Widescreen projection changed the look and the feel of the movie, look of it a little bit. But more important, post-war films started to say things. They started to discuss complex points of view. Now, here's an important point, a key point. If I was teaching a class, I'd say, put this in your notes. During the war itself, the films tended to be flag-waving stuff, daring-do kind of stuff. But when the war was over and the wartime sensibility ended, the war movie was now free to illuminate and interpret any social or moral issue. The war movie recreated itself. So the war was hardly over. Here's an example. With the war hardly over, production started on what we could call a non-war war movie. What do I mean by that? It was dealing with veterans who were readjusting to civilian life. The movie was called The Best Years of Our Lives. It swept all of the Oscars. As a matter of fact, Spielberg, to this day, thinks it's such an important film that he sees it, he screens it once a year to this day. Now, one of its most remarkable aspects, that one of its three protagonists was an actual war veteran, real thing. And he was, by the way, a non-professional actor. He was an amateur. Now, during the war, he had suffered a grievous wound that, believe me, no Hollywood makeup guy could get close to. So get out your Kleenex and more or less show him Homer's Homecoming.
It's Homer! Mama, Mama, Daddy, it's Homer!
Okay, let's go.
Well? Oh, don't. I'll carry it. What's the matter, Ma?
It's nothing.
It's just that your ma's so glad to see you home.
Yeah, I know.
Well, that'll do it. And I think you can see why that was such a powerful movie. And that was not the only scene that was so powerful. Now, after the war, not surprisingly, there was a serious question among studio heads. Hey, was the public actually getting tired of World War II movies? But 1949 gave that answer, that the war movie was alive and well. That was the year of a blockbuster called Battleground. It was a formula movie. It was all the cliches that we talked about the squad and the sergeant and all that kind of stuff. And yet, it was the highest grossing movie in the last 5 years. So it proved something about the durability of the World War II movie. But that year also saw one of my all-time favorites. It was an airplane movie, and it didn't deal with planes. It was 12 O'Clock High. That was the name of the picture. As I say, it's one of my all-time favorite lists. It dealt with planes. It didn't deal with planes. It dealt with the psychological pressures of command. Here you have a picture in which it's the general that has the nervous breakdown, not the private. And interestingly, this picture had a second life as a management training film. It dealt with leadership. If I told you to see Casablanca tonight, tomorrow night, see 12 O'Clock High. So just the greatest movie. By the way, the leading man, Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck was just the handsomest guy you're ever going to see. I mean, you can have your Regine Page or whoever it is, or Daniel Craig. Boy, just get a look at Gregory Peck. And also in 1949, there was a movie that you've probably never heard of. It was a so-so film. It was not all that well received. I want to mention it to you because it was the first war movie that I know of that walked right up to the question of racism. It dealt with a Black soldier who's he was the protagonist, but his nemesis was a redneck bigot. Now, point being that this was an early manifestation of the racial pictures that were going to come later. What Martin Luther King was a little bit later than this, but this movie was a forerunner. Now, in spite of their perpetual concern about whether World War II movies would go, Hollywood kept on grinding them out. For example, between 1955 and 1960, that's between 10 and 15 years after the war, I counted 51 World War II movies, and I'm sure I missed something. Now, they were the usual stuff. They were okay. But by the mid-60s, you could say that war movies were entering what you could say was their golden age, but I think that golden age exists right until now. Starting in the 60s, you could put whatever you wanted in a movie. Send Up Like Dirty Dozen. You could have Holocaust pictures like Schindler's List, The Pianist, POW films, The Great Escape. You could even challenge morality of the war itself. Bridge in the River Kwai, which, by the way, I think is one of the greatest movies ever made. By the way, you don't have to take my word for what's a great movie. Make your own list. Just go on Google, look tonight at best World War II movies, and you'll find all kinds of charts, so-and-so's best 15 or best 25, and pick out the ones that you like. By the way, today we're only talking about American movies. You want to go international, oh my God, there's no limit. Das Boot being a perfect example. Incidentally, I don't have time to show you a film clip of Bridge in the River Kwai, but if you want a great opening scene, in many ways as moving, slightly different sense, moving as Saving Private Ryan, look at the first opening 3 minutes of Bridge on the River Kwai. Well, following World War II, we saw the remake of the Image of the Enemy. Americans had two wars. The war with Germany was ideological. War with Japan, racial. Now, the movies that had Germans in them, you always knew who the bad German was, who was the evil Nazi. It'd be very easily identifiable. As far as the other Germans, well, hey, they look just like Americans. And remember, there were a whole lot of first and second generation German Americans. And as far as Germany's well-known anti-Semitism was concerned, frankly, that didn't bother the American public at all. You remember, nobody knew anything about the Holocaust. Even the term Holocaust became courant only in the 1960s. And there was a tremendous uptick in anti-Semitism during World War II. Not only did you have the Charles Lindberghs, but you had a whole bunch of professional anti-Semitism. Now, attitudes toward the Japanese, utterly different. As I said, the war with Japan was racial. Exhibit A, in February of 42, 125,000 people of, quote, Japanese ancestry, whatever that meant, were relocated from the West Coast and put in what could only be called concentration camps. By the way, Japanese ancestry, that term, It included 85,000 who were American citizens. But racial or not, the animosity towards Japan, American attitudes toward Japan were put together the very first day of the war, when the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. That galvanized the Americans. By the way, all through the war, you heard the expression sneak attack, by the way, as if it was hyphenated. But the animus, national animus towards Japan got a big jolt in 1943. What happened in 1943? Well, remember, I had told you that those 25,000 Americans captured in the Philippines went into captivity. Boy, you don't want to know the horror story that greeted those guys in captivity. Let me give you a quick statistic. If an American prisoner of the Germans, his chances of survival were probably 96, maybe 97%, and he died of natural causes. If he was a prisoner of the Japanese, his chances of survival were 27%. So what happened in 1943? Well, 3 American officers escaped from Japanese captivity, made it back to America, and published in every magazine available their description of life in a Japanese prison. And that's when Americans became aware of what we call the Bataan death march. So, although there might have been some good Germans in films, there were no good Japanese. By the way, and here's a footnote, why there were so few Japanese in American movies during the war. Well, there weren't that many Japanese around. They were all incarcerated in those internment camps. But after the war, as we know, ex-enemies became ex-friends, and ex-friends became enemies. And while there was still evil, Gestapo, SS guys, easily identifiable because they'd be Heil Hitlering all over the place, and they'd have swastikas on their arm. But the attitudes towards the ordinary German was softened. And also, by the way, the anti-Japanese attitudes softened perceptibly and very quickly after the war. But it took a much longer time for that to be reflected in the movies, and especially with the Japanese. By the end of 1970, though, we could say that the film war with Japan ended with a 1970 film called Tora, Tora, Tora. It's an interesting picture. It was an American production with Japanese participation. 5 minutes. Okay, I'll make it quicker. It was with Japanese participation. And by the way, of all the things they could do, all the things to put in, the picture dealt with the destruction of the American fleet, which was, I use the word irony. I think my mother would have just said, so go figure. Anyway, television history, here's something, television history about the miniseries. A miniseries is a completely different genre, so I'm not going to go into it now. But for me, there was nothing as great as the Band of Brothers in 2001. That was a great, by the way, parenthetically, let me just make a note here. One of the production writers in that was my own student from the history department here at NYU. His name is Max Fry, and he's still producing to this day. Okay, here's a warning I mentioned in my opening remarks. Never trust a film that purports to teach you history. Don't pay any attention to a movie that is, the battle of this or the battle of that. Don't think for a minute that you know really what happened to Dunkirk because you saw the movie Dunkirk. All you know about the movie Dunkirk, had something to do with the beach and it had something to do with the Brits, and that's all you know. It's as if you were trying to learn English history by watching Bridge. Movies are concerned with entertainment, period. And if you don't like history movies, or if I don't like history movies, I think biographies are even worse. By the way, that said, as far as biographies go, Patton is definitely the best of the lot. There's no question that Patton was a very, very complicated guy, but so is George C. Scott, the guy that, but like all film biographies, the misrepresentations, exaggerations, distortions, the Brits are all caricatures. But let's look at the famous opening of Patton's speech. Okay, can we have it, Maura?
You seated? I want you to remember that no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor dumb bastard die for his country. Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans.
Okay. Okay. By the way, that was his standard stump speech. He gave that speech dozens and dozens of times. The only difference was it was complete profanity. By the way, about the profanity, it may have inspired some soldiers, but it appalled most. They'll take that kind of language from their top sergeant. They will not accept it from their commanding general. My main point is that World War II never ended, cinematically speaking. After 75 years, if you don't believe me, just go on Google World War II movies. You'll see all kinds of movies in the last 5 years, 7 years, and you'll see all the names that you know: Tom Hanks, Daniel Craig, Colin Firth, Jude Law, Benedict Cumberbatch, and everybody else. Look, if I can make a personal observation, when I was teaching at NYU, a course in World War II, the largest group invariably of academic majors in my class were film people. Maybe that's a clue. Maybe they saw in World War II a good mechanism for observing the human condition. Anyway, this afternoon we've been talking only about American movies, but if we went worldwide movies, there have been about 1,300 since 1945, and not only big film producing countries, but 32 countries. Latvia, Albania, Finland. How about Switzerland and Sweden? They were both neutral. So what kind of World War II pictures are you going to get there? But that just shows you the prevalence of the World War II film. I can't imagine anybody today making a film about Korea or Vietnam or Iraq. Cinematically speaking, those wars have come and gone, but World War II persists. So we ask ourselves, why? Why World War II? Well, I suggest it was just so gigantic in all its dimensions, physical, emotional. It traumatized entire societies. It was the seminal event of the 20th century. So this adds up to an extraordinary potential for storytelling. Little military exploits, reassessments. Most of all, we are attracted to World War II because of its moral certainties. Put in other words, its lack of moral ambiguity. It was always a war of good and bad. You try explaining Iraq or Afghanistan to kids, but you'd have no trouble explaining D-Day. So you would think that there are no stories left to tell, nothing more to say. Don't count on it. I think World War II movies are here to stay for quite a while. Anyway, thank you for listening.
Ellie, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We have an outpouring of questions. So thank you for all those. I want to get right into them. And Ellie, there are a number of questions about how World War II movies have changed over time. And so let me get to one of them. And here it is from Timothy Fitzsimmons. Did the revelations in the trial of Eichmann and the world's understanding of the full extent of what occurred in World War II result in a change in World War II narratives or in World War II stories as depicted in war movies?
In general, no, but then you get into specific, there was a movie called Conspiracy, which dealt with the Wannsee Conference. There are any number of Holocaust movies. The question is, what changed, what big change occur, and how did it influence the movies? It would, not in a general sense, it would be a specific sense. I'd have to go movie by movie to answer that question. It's a very good question, and I compliment the questioner.
So there's a question about what is your personal favorite war movie and why? And then the second part of that question is, do you think that there is an all-time public favorite movie or most successful World War II movie?
Well, first of all, popular Saving Private Ryan, certainly a popular movie. My favorite, I think, is Bridge on the River Kwai. It was a movie that questioned morality. It questioned a lot of basic attitudes about the military. It told you about the military. It told you, it explored a lot of the human emotion. I also told you that I liked 12 O'Clock High, which was a personal favorite of mine, just because it dealt with this question of leadership, and it was a psychological movie. Yeah, I would say Bridge on the River Kwai. I urge everybody to see that movie. It was great. The opening will move you, believe me.
Yeah, there's still that Casablanca scene brings tears to my eyes every time. Here's another, just one fascinating question after the other. Here's one on, there are a couple of questions about the role of consultants, military consultants. And so the question here is, were films become more accurate historically as time goes on? Are the recent films more accurate than the old films?
Are they more accurate? I would say not necessarily. By the way, I mentioned Dunkirk. I mean, you know, I don't think that was accurate at all. And it was a very popular movie. For technical accuracy, I mentioned that film Fury. That had production values that were so perfect. If anybody wants to know what World War II looked like from the infantry and the tank, see Brad Pitt's Fury. Now, about accuracy, yeah, the more time has passed, the more accurate the pictures have become in technical terms. But historical terms, I don't think, as I said, I was one of the few that just did not like Dunkirk.
Laura Gibson asks, do you think that the subsequent 2 wars with Asian enemies, Korea and Vietnam, kept what you called the movie war against the Japanese going longer, even though the US was allied with Japan by that time?
No, that's a very good question. No, I don't. No, I don't think it changed anything. I was surprised that how long it took to come to grips with Japan in the war. By the way, it got to the eventual ending of the celluloid war with Japan was 2007 with Flag of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima. Those were, you know, very, I won't say pro-Japanese, but they were certainly, they addressed the Japanese-American relationship. Although the animosity with Japan ameliorated very quickly after the war, as it did with Germany, as I say, it took longer for that to percolate into the film world.
There's a question from James Rotenberg. World War I generated anti-war movies. And I can think of, Oh, What a Lovely War. It's just one of the most powerful anti-war movies. And so the question is, has World War II similarly generated any kind of anti-war movies, with the exception of Hiroshima Mon Amour, which of course is a French movie, not an American?
It's a very interesting question. It's a great question. By the way, anti-war, All Quiet on the Western Front is, in my mind, the greatest anti-war movie ever made. You want to see an anti-war movie, see that one. There have been few really anti-war movies that I can think of. I remember one called, it was not popular, it was called The Victors, and it was really brutal and uncomfortable, and it made the Americans, it reversed all of the little cliches that I've talked about. It stood them on its head. It was not a very popular movie. I felt it very uncomfortable. So the answer is, are there very many anti-war movies? I can't think of, you know, you're mentioning Hiroshima Mon Amour. No, I think the World War II movies tend to be, I hate to use the word pro-war, but they harped on characteristics like valor and humanity and comradeship. So no, I don't see very many anti-war movies.
Time for just a few more. Gene Sofer asks, were there films that took place on the Eastern Front and recognized the role of Russian troops?
Ooh, that's a good one. It's very interesting. Only a couple of, maybe a month ago, I saw a Russian World War II movie, and it's really very au courant. I mean, it's only maybe a year old. What shocked me was it was the complete formula. It was a tank movie with the last stand and with the crew. And I was shocked. I said, "My God, here's an international movie, a Russian movie." Now, so the question is, how are Russian movies? The movie Stalingrad, I think, was a great. I think that was an American-made movie. Was it with Jude Law? It was once again a very heroic movie. It was how would the Russians perceived heroically. So that would be my answer. That the Russian movies. I'm thinking about how I can't think about how American movies, except that one movie, Stalingrad, portrayed Russians, but other than heroically.
Yeah, there are a couple of possibilities. People mention Catch-22. They mention Paths of Glory as possible movies.
By the way, that's good. Paths of Glory. Well, yes, by the way, whoever suggested that, and if you suggested, those were good. Catch-22 with its sarcastic, wise-ass stuff. It was, yes, that had to be that had to be an anti-war movie. And what else did you mention?
Catch-22.
Catch-22, yeah, it was anti-war.
Yeah, anti-war book for sure. Okay, two more. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to get to everybody, but we've been going on for a long time. And so here's an interesting question from Dave Rudin. Would you describe World War II movies as historical fiction?
That's not a bad description. I compliment the question. Yeah, I think it was a historical question because I've made the point. Don't depend on movies to teach you history. So they're all, World War II has been used as a mechanism to describe all kinds of other situations. But historically, don't count on them. I can't stress this enough. Movies are not history. So in answer to that question, how did he phrase it? What was
historical fiction?
By the way, it's a great, I'm going to use that expression myself. It's historical fiction.
I think we'll end with this question, and that is there an event from World War II that hasn't been made into a film that you would be interested in seeing?
Isn't that interesting? No, I can't think. I mean, as well as I know World War II, every conceivable issue, I mean, escape movies have been, or I told you, battle movies. I mean, there are millions, the battle of this, the battle of that. It's funny. I showed you that film clip of Bataan. I had always a specific interest in that campaign. It was not well known. It was a disaster for the Americans. And there was that film, Bataan. There was another film called Back to Bataan. And there was a Navy picture called They Were Expendable. But I would love, personally, you're asking me, I would love to see a great first-rate movie about that unknown Philippine campaign. But that's a personal attitude and not to be taken too seriously.
Well, Ellie, I want to thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I could only tell you about a fraction of the questions that appeared both on the Q&A tab and in the chat. And so I want to thank all of you for your active participation in this. It sparked a wonderful conversation. And I hope you'll come back to other history salons. Some of you probably went to the two earlier ones we had this year, but the first one was by David Oshinsky, who talked about the history of pandemics. And the second one was by Kimberly Phillips Fine, who's a specialist in the history of New York. And she talked about the near bankruptcy of the city of New York in the 1970s. And now we have, Ellie, this wonderful, wonderful talk about World War II in the movies. So I thank you for that. I thank all of you for attending. And I hope to see you in the fall, maybe even in person, or the next history salon that we'll give you. Take care, everybody, and good night.